All right, thanks, Alan. It's a lot warmer in Boca Raton, where you are, than it is in Boulder, Colorado, and it's 10 degrees in our office. We're all wearing coats, and we're drinking mimosas. So if you check our Twitter feed, you can validate that with a picture that we've recently put up there. I'm Todd. I'm the CEO and co-founder of VictorOps, and I have a couple other people who are speaking today. Why don't you introduce yourself?
This is Joni Klippert. I'm the VP of Product at VictorOps.
And I'm Jessica Kahn. I'm doing content marketing, and I ran the survey this year.
Jessica did all the heavy lifting on this thing. We're just, commentating. We're doing color commentation. So with that, let's kick it off. Welcome to the third annual State of On-Call webinar, where we will unveil the data we collected about the hardest job in software and IT, being on call. Being that person that responds to problems in the middle of the night has never been easy. But as you will hear today, the job is only getting more critical to the success of nearly all organizations. We started the State of On-Call series specifically to capture data around the job that is critically important in all businesses, specifically those that rely on technology to deliver their value to customers. The world continues to be more and more software-driven. Reliance on IT, enterprise software, SaaS platforms have transitioned from company supporting to absolutely mission critical. Companies that would historically update production software a few times a year now update software many times a day. More progressive organizations literally continuously deploy software around the clock. Innovation and competitive advantage is now in the hands of software engineers in these companies, and in many cases, so too is the successful operation of this software. In the most progressive organizations, unit testing is now the majority of testing that is done before software hits production. These organizations have determined it's better to fix incremental problems fast in production than delay service updates for weeks while QA attempts to find bugs that are often data dependent anyway. This change in the way organizations embrace technology is not only made the job of being on call more difficult, but literally put developers on the front line of defense. With that, let's dig into the 2016-2017 State of On-Call report.
Great. Thanks, Todd. So let's go to the next slide and see who took the report this year. Took the survey. So we had over 800 respondents. That's the most we've had. Of those people, 89% of them actually spend time on call, and most of the other 11% manage people on call. They came from a really diverse group of industries. 29 different industries were represented. There's a really good mix between people who supported internal customers, external customers, or both. And also, size ranged a lot as well. We had people all the way from companies that had 1 to 25 people all the way up to over 10,000.
So just to be clear, these were not customers of ours. We sourced these people through some of our partners.
They came from a lot of different sources, yes.
Got it. And I think they're on the last slide, right? I'll slide the people that took the survey.
I think it's in the report.
It's in the report.
In the report.
All right, sounds good.
So we can go to the next.
Great. So kind of the big question that always comes up is, how do people feel about it? Right? On-call has historically been kind of a tough job to do. It continues to be a tough job to do. And the data sort of shows, a very consistent trend, not a trend, but a consistent, way that it's always been. The feelings surrounding being on call are pretty much holding steady in 3 separate groups of people. The first group feels anxious about the job and everything that goes with it. The second group is neutral. They can take it or leave it. And the third group really embrace the realities of on-call. These buckets have remained fairly static through the years, through every time we've presented this data. I think it's our belief that this is, largely been due to the historically rudimentary adoption of on-call methodologies. For example, companies implementing generic on-call rotations, not aligning skill sets to problems, lack of alert annotations and data reuse, and the lack of training and retrospective meetings have kind of left these 3 groups the way they are. Still, the vast majority of organizations utilize generic on-call rotations to put people on the front line of the problem that by definition can actually be solved by the person in many cases that was paged or alerted to the problem. this is a practice we see changing as more mature solutions come into the market.
All right, so let's break down what we learned. When we gave this survey and we got hundreds of people write in very specifically about why they were really happy or really miserable, and it was pretty intense to read, I have to say, but we did see some trends. So the people who were really miserable on call, there were several common reasons. First of all, many people have terrible work-life balance. We heard stories of suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder. Some people can never relax. We had one guy who said he was on call, I think, every day the whole year. So when you don't get a chance to have a break, you're pretty much in a bad place. So clearly that's a problem. So also many people are supporting poorly designed systems, whether that's the actual infrastructure or whether they just have on-call set up in a really bad way at their company. And then many also feel powerless to solve problems. They don't know what's going on. They could be dealing with excessive noise, or they're supporting parts of a system that they don't understand, and they don't have access to the people who are the experts. And then finally, there are a lot of people who just aren't wired for this role at all. They find being on call and having to fight fires extremely stressful, and it's probably just not a good fit for them.
And I think that's something we see every year in the data is there's certain personality types that really like coming to work and having something different happen every day and like the challenge of those kind of things, which I think have historically attracted operational people in these kind of companies. But with DevOps, you're starting to see sort of a mixture of engineering and operations people, and sometimes not all of those people have the same, they get excited about a new challenge every day that really kind of, takes them off guard and puts them in uncomfortable. Conversely, there's the people that kind of go the other way, which I think you're going to talk about next.
Yeah, I will. So if you go to the next slide, on the other extreme, we've got some people who are extremely happy on call. And here are some of the things that we saw. So they have the right tools and systems. So the tools work well. They have reliable teammates. If they're not an expert in an area they're supporting, they have really quick and easy access to people who are, so they can actually get those answers reliably. And then in more sophisticated organizations, people were saying that they actually owned their code, and they take pride in fixing the problems that happen with their code and supporting it from end to end. Kind of makes sense, but this is a new concept for a lot of people. And then there's this strong sense of satisfaction. So what Todd just said, the flip side of being completely stressed out on call is the feeling of being relied on and being able to be the person that solves the problem. And some people find that intrinsically really satisfying. And then finally, they mention a culture of learning. So some companies are really transparent. They are continuously learning how to do things better, and they have a really supportive environment. And the good news is that all of these are very DevOps-oriented practices. And if we go to the next slide, you'll see how we asked about DevOps and how that's breaking down.
Yeah, and just to kind of touch on that last slide Jessica was talking about is, I think it's, the thing I've always noticed, I started my career as a software engineer 20-some years ago, and I never had a problem with kind of being thrown into the firefight as long as it was things I knew how to solve. What I didn't like was being thrown into a firefight about a part of the system I've never seen before, and I think that kind of goes to a lot of the dissatisfaction numbers. I think most engineers that I know would love to jump in and help solve a problem if it's something they're intimately knowledgeable about. So again, I think that's kind of a place where most enterprises and companies can kind of improve their story. As we get on to kind of DevOps practices with this slide, I think what it says is the proliferation of DevOps practices continues. And I would characterize it as a pretty fast market. If you look at the data, it's almost perfectly split between companies at different stages of adoption out to 5 years. However, the largest segment in the data have been practicing about 1 to 2 years. To me, this suggests that future reports, even in the short term, will show adoption rates approaching 75% of companies that are that are responding to this survey. And interestingly, I think that data is consistent with recently commissioned study from Rackspace supporting that about 66% of respondents have already adopted some DevOps methodology. To me, in the language, if you kind of look at this in the language of business, this is kind of a classic pull market, meaning suggesting the adoption is coming from within companies, not being pushed by vendors as a strategy into the market. This is a real thing that's happening, and clearly, what was state of the art 5 years ago is just not good enough for today's business environment, and I think that comes out in the data. Another kind of interesting thing around DevOps is the more DevOps oriented you are as a company, the happier kind of you are with this on-call thing. And I think we could probably talk for a long time about this kind of thing, but it really boils down to a couple simple things, like you're much more likely to be familiar with larger parts of the system or how the system integrates with the actual business. Which is a common theme with DevOps, is being attached more closely to the business. Literally, the more time companies spend with DevOps practices, the happier they are with on-call responsibilities. This is basically coming down to being more prepared for problems when they occur and more tools to automate the delivery of solutions after correcting the problem. So rather than changing some part of the production environment to sort of quickly remediate a problem, the more progressive companies are changing it in source and pushing to production in a few seconds. So it's the same activity they do every single day, not a one-off activity as they firefight. Again, Puppet's recent State of DevOps report states that more frequently a company deploys, the faster their recovery times when problems occur, which totally makes sense to us, and I think some of the respondents we saw here. Simply put, if releases are something you do once in a while, they're much harder to do and trust. This leads to stress, problems, and general unhappiness. A couple other stats I'll just pull out of Puppet's report because it's an excellent report is the best performers with DevOps do 200 times more frequent code deployments, 24 times faster mean time to recover, and three times lower change failure rate, which is interesting. And then a particularly interesting piece of data I found was employees are 2.2 times more likely to recommend their organization to friends as a place to work. So clearly, just to kind of put a capstone in the DevOps part of this is employees are happier. It serves the company better because problems can be solved faster. And it's a lot less stressful in this general state of being on call if you've taken the time, put the tools in place, and fixing problems is more like deploying than one-off activities.
Great. Next, we dug in a little bit more on the actual structure of on-call teams, both from the roles and then how the size of those teams are changing. So something to note in this survey as compared to previous years is self-identification as an IT professional, as sort of your primary function for being on call, is becoming less pervasive. Whereas IT was really high up, let's see, it's number 4 this year as a role cited as being on call. Earlier years it was number 1 or 2. This year it's number 4. And number 1 is still operations, but number 2 and 3 are falling closely with folks that represent themselves as the developer or a DevOps professional as having on-call responsibilities, again, sort of showing this trend in the market. We also see continued adoption of DevOps in the sheer number of people who are reported as having on-call responsibilities. In past years, this was something like fewer than 10. This year, on average, our companies who responded to this survey show that 40 people in their organization, on average, are in Tier 1 support, and then on average 70 people within each organization are part of the downstream remediation process. So that's definitely grown in significant scale from previous years. So as we touched on earlier, one of the most pervasive issues in this role of being on call is alert fatigue and the notion of having a lot of noise in your system. While it continues to plague on-call engineers, and as a percentage it's consistent with previous years, something I thought was interesting is that this year 62% of respondents are proactively working to remediate noise by a few things. They represent that they're trying to be more proactive in working to remediate noise by making alerts contextual, actionable, and reducing redundant alarms. And they're doing this as frequently as weekly, during on-call handoffs, or during their on-call shift. And I think this is showing, from a process perspective, a lot of maturity and discipline in tackling alert fatigue. So it's a very promising behavior to have folks report in this survey.
All right. So automation, microservices, and containers. We asked, I think, some more questions around this year, and part of it was kind of kicked off by the fact that we see a lot of this in our customer base. So we asked some more qualifying questions. You know, since we started doing these surveys three years ago, I think, automation tools have always been an area of fast adoption. In many ways, automation tools started the DevOps revolution and continue to be the main reason companies initially explore DevOps. And then I think as they have success with these tools, it's really kind of what pushes things forward for a lot of these companies. 70% of respondents say they're making meaningful moves towards microservices and containers. Driving this is the desire to decouple monolithic architectures for easier remediation and reliability. But also another significant reason stated for adopting microservice architectures is to increase code ownership by development groups and faster resolution of problems due to code and operational familiarity. And we see this a lot every day, and essentially kind of this combination of microservices and containers, the code ownership that is kind of fostered by having that sort of setup, and then the ability to route on-call problems to that group is sort of kind of the magic triangle of happiness for some of the people that that are buying our service and maybe some other services as well. And I think it really kind of will drive that data we talked about earlier about being happy about being on call.
Next, we looked at which tools were most important during the firefight, and the following were cited in order as the most valuable. I think the first year we did this survey, email was actually #1, which was shocking. And this year we see things like logs being #1, and then chat platforms holding, the top 2 spots, with chat and collaboration and this notion of involving others in the firefight being, secondary to logs themselves, with email coming in last. So there's definitely been a shift into, just the basic tooling that people are using to do this job. I felt that logs at #1 was pretty interesting, and in discussions with some of our development team, I think it's because what's happening in DevOps is you have to push out code faster. I mean, in business in general these days, you're releasing far more frequently, and in order to do that, there are just more unknown unknowns. So when there are known unknowns, you instrument monitoring for that, and there's certainly a lot of room for growth in that area as well. But the notion of using tools like Splunk or Sumo Logic or others to help you very quickly in a release identify your unknown unknowns and then deploy to solve for those things also very quickly, it leads to sort of this notion of logs being as #1 on that spectrum.
Itil, let's talk about something that's super passionate and super polarized. So I think this might be the first year we asked questions around Itil. I'm getting a nod from Jessica. Itil is a very interesting subject, not only kind of out there, but in our customer base, and I'm sure others, is, this is the first year we ask questions regarding Itil standards. Itil is, for those who don't know, because you would suggest the data would suggest 50% of you do not know. Itil is a historically adopted standard for helping align IT services with the needs of business. I've been doing this kind of stuff for over 20 years, and it was a bigger deal, at least in my mind in the past. But if you just kind of look at the data, it's clear from the data respondents are fairly polarized around the concepts of Itil in progressive organizations specifically. While some respondents applaud the rigid structure of Itil that keep production environments stable and static. Others simply believe its time has come and gone and is completely incompatible with progressive, fast-paced environments. 26% of respondents are trying to live in both worlds, which is interesting. We see this at in the VictorOps customer base too, and our enterprise customers as well, with newer services within larger companies being run as agile methodologies, and older services within the same company and also representing sometimes the majority of the revenue staying with Itil. So clearly companies are kind of trying to deal with this ambiguity of being agile and fast versus stable, and and the implication is often slower. It's our opinion that organizations that have embraced Itil will continue to do so for current lines of business, but will probably move away for newer lines, and companies that have not historically embraced Itil won't likely do so going forward. So I think this is an interesting area where we'll probably collect some more data next year now that we have some baseline data and can be able to report on some changes there. This is a subject, this next slide, about kind of what's it goes to the cost of downtime, which I think is a really interesting subject that I talk to larger customers about all the time. So we kind of ask, what are the, you sort of can vote on as many things as you want to in the survey. So the data, doesn't add up to 100%, but it does kind of paint a clear picture of what the perceived costs of downtime are. At 56%, well, by far the largest is just direct revenue loss, right? And that in a large, Fortune 1000 company, this is, I can't remember if this is an IDC or a Forrester report, but we'll tweet it out when I do my homework on that.
It's IDC.
Is IDC, great? Yeah, the cost of downtime, according to IDC, can be $500,000 to $1 million an hour in a Fortune 1000 company. So I think everybody has a general feeling that that's the case. There's been surprisingly little data published on it, but if you talk to most companies, they definitely recognize that a loss of direct revenue is sort of the -- thing at 56% of respondents. But what I thought is interesting, the rest of respondents, the rest of the responses to me read kind of like a business horror story. Diminished perception of brand and customer defection were both popular selections, resonating with almost half of all respondents to the survey. And the way I look at it is direct revenue loss is bad, and and you can add that up. But the loss of all future revenue from a customer that decides to defect or goes to a different solution is even worse. So you're not only losing, the revenue you lost in that hour, but you're losing all future revenue from that customer, and specifically in SaaS businesses that are reoccurring businesses. So, I think we talk about this a little bit in our predictions at the end, but definitely I think there'll be a lot more attention paid to this as platforms, and specifically SaaS, becomes kind of the major way to do business.
So in the DevOps space, there's a lot of time sort of spent on the software delivery chain and how DevOps affects sort of from build to running in production. And we like to look at extending that into also incident management maturity. And so we've been working on creating questions that help people understand sort of where they can place themselves on this spectrum of maturity in the incident management space. So we have 4 very broad buckets, not really specific to any tooling at all, but more of just a sense of how you're capturing and applying information here. So as a beginner, that's the notion of having little to no operational stack awareness, poor communication between dev and ops. Imagine dev throwing their code over that wall to ops, and ops trying to operate it, and some of the conflicts that exist there, and also just slowness that exists there in terms of being able to deliver business value. Next is this notion of a novice, right? You have some defined processes and roles and some monitoring in place, but maybe not a lot of confidence about the scope of that monitoring. In the intermediate world, people identify themselves as having, more than basic monitoring, and also some consistent real-time collaboration processes and key health indicators about their infrastructure and how that relates to business. Whereas advanced is sort of, full stack awareness via automation and very proactive empathy across the entire software delivery lifecycle, including running that in production. So when we asked folks to look at where they would place themselves, it's kind of split down the middle between novice and intermediate. So this is showing a lot of potential for the market in terms of extending this notion of DevOps and proactivity into actual incident remediation during the incident management lifecycle. So next we can go over just a few of the, I like that we put the TLDR at the end of the presentation. Hope you don't mind.
It doesn't flatter these guys. They stuck it out to the end.
That's funny. Okay, but to recap some of the learnings that we found during this survey this year is that, as we mentioned very early on, the state of on-call in terms of, having a really poor time, being a little ambivalent about the role, or also feeling very good and positive and proactive about the role. It's steady, but the responsibilities within those roles are indeed shifting. So respondents are equally split, like we talked about, between good, bad, and neutral. The on-call is really diversifying, and I think it's fair that there's some pain associated with that. These are new behaviors for folks. We have new people who, traditional developers whose whole job has been to consistently deliver business value, and we know that that's a very difficult job. That's often, as a product person planning sprints, they're always over full. And then the idea that these people are also taking on-call responsibilities after hours can cause some conflict, and it can be difficult. And so there's a lot of room for maturity there to make this a smoother process. But also what we see on the very positive side is with more people involved in the on-call process, and as people mature here, there's a lot more specialization. So we are getting rid of this notion of some arbitrary on-call schedule where a human who knows nothing about the problem is simply just a triage step. That's frustrating for the human on the front line, and it costs a lot to the business in the process of getting correct alerts to the person who ultimately can solve the problem. With more DevOps initiatives, there's generally less pain on call, and Jessica talked a lot about that earlier on in the presentation. So this culture of learning is really critical. And as we saw, 62% are taking proactive steps to improve alert fatigue. This is the #1 pain point in the market, and I'm excited to see what people continue to do to alleviate this pain. Chat is growing, right? Opposed to these sort of asynchronous communications like ticketing systems and emails, those are going by the wayside, and now it's about more synchronous communication and chat and other tools to help us remediate problems. And also we discussed, 56% reported a loss of revenue as a major cost of downtime, and then Todd just went into, some of those secondary and even more compounding factors that relate to costs to the business of downtime itself.
All right, I think we're on to predictions now. The predictions are always kind of the fun part for me. It's a combination of what we heard from people, but also kind of what we hear in our business and talking to a lot of people in the industry. So if you kind of just go down the list here, we believe more people will take on-call responsibility covering their areas of expertise. We talked a little bit about this with microservices and code ownership and vectoring problems to the person that can actually solve the problem to reduce stress and those kind of things. Real-time remediation of problems is transitioning quickly to a team sport, is what we call it kind of internally here at VictorOps. Within fast-moving companies, the adoption of microservices and service-oriented architectures are putting a new focus on code ownership. Code ownership is a key trait of writing better code, and more engineers are happy to support code they own rather than code they've never seen. This trend is positive for engineers and for companies. A better life for the engineer, but also faster remediation for companies. Kind of the second thought here is rapid recovery will be increasingly critical for companies' viability, specifically in the SaaS space. Software delivery and deployment cycles are asymptotically approaching zero time between releases for progressive companies. Literally, we talk to companies every day that do hundreds of releases a day. So this is no longer something that's kind of happens in a cyclic manner. It happens all the time. and this leaves no time for intermediate problem solvers, meaning, for many companies, a network operations center just doesn't work. Those people cannot solve a problem that comes in expeditiously enough. A pure operations role, I think I mentioned this last year, and I feel even more passionate about it this year. The pure operations role, specifically at an individual contributor level, is going away. It's not going away in every company, but it's going away in the most progressive companies and in specifically SaaS businesses. For the last 3 years, we have seen substantial movement from dedicated operators of technology to DevOps methodologies and code ownership by people who created the code in the first place. This year continued that trend, and we do not expect that trend to reverse. There remains a place for dedicated operations people, but those roles are transitioning to strategy and roles like site reliability as opposed to simply operators of code. So our advice is up your game. If you're in a pure operations role, get into this strategy moves, but besides that, a lot of your stuff is becoming automated, so look out. Alerting is table stakes. Companies are moving all into real-time incident management for many of the reasons I mentioned above. It's to be agile and fast and not have to employ days or weeks of testing of code, but simply put the code into production and fix it if it breaks is becoming the way it is, and people are buying solutions to do all of that, not just being alerted to problems. And that is also, I think, a trend that will continue. And downtime will become more expensive, not less expensive. As companies continue moving more and more of their functionality to SaaS platforms, those SaaS platforms will be expected to have 100% uptime all the time. And that will significantly drive certainly the results in this webinar, but also a lot of people's lives.
All right, so that is the bulk of our presentation. I want to thank some people who helped us promote the survey. These are actually in the report, but DevOps.com, thanks you guys. O'Reilly, SRE Weekly, DevOps Weekly, Vivid Cortex, New Relic, some of our VCs, a bunch of different people helped get the survey out there. And I just also wanted to say that, of course, if you're interested in upping your game, go to our VictorOps.com/start free trial, and we are happy to work with you. And I think, Alan, you're up for any questions that came through.
Yes, I am, and thank you. Before we get to questions, though, let me just congratulate Scott and Heather and the whole team. This was a having done surveys now for a bunch of time myself, I know what it goes into them. But to do this 3 years in a row and kind of build on it year after year and expand, it's nice. And you know what? I really do think this was the best one yet. So congratulations, team, on a great State of On-Call report for this year.
Yeah, thanks, Alan. I think, and all these things always get better as you have more and more years of data because you can start to see trends in the data. And, I think coupled with the fact that, this subject matter rides heavily on sort of what's going on with DevOps. It's sort of it goes hand in hand with that wave. There's a lot of change every year in, how people respond to the questions, but not only that, sort of their motivations and the things they deal with day in, day out. So I think that makes for a rich environment to do these kind of studies. So we're looking forward to doing it going forward as well.
Sure. Guys, before we jump into some specific questions, one question that came up was where people can get the reports and stuff, and even the previous years as well. Todd, actually, we may have it even on DevOps.com in our digital downloads. But Todd, I imagine they can get them off of the VictorOps website?
Yeah, Jessica, I think, has the answer to that.
Yeah, we're going to send an email to everyone who registered and attended this event, and there will be a link to the report. You can all get that. And if you go to our site, you will also be able to download the past year's reports as well.
Fantastic. All right, let's jump in.
And I was just going to say, Alan, even in this year's report, there's more data than we presented. We cut some slides out for brevity, so there's good stuff to go get and look at.
Yep. Okay, let's jump into some questions here, guys. You know, it seems that you're saying that DevOps practices are the way to get better at being on call. But, you know, a common question we always hear, great, I want to do this DevOps thing. It sounds great. Where do we start? And specifically to on-call and DevOps practices, you know, getting better, making you better at on-call. Where do you start?
I'll answer, and then other people in the room can kind of augment with anything they have. What we see happen, it depends on the size of the organization. If it's a small organization, they're obviously a lot more nimble, and they have sort of the ability to just change. We're just going to change the way we do things. Or this company starts as something that's, you know, closer to kind of where the thought process is going. But in larger organizations, what we see are, and I think this answer was maybe even appeared in the report that we just talked about, was what you'll see is, you know, these large, you know, Fortune 1000, Fortune 500 companies, especially in SaaS businesses, what they'll do is when they release a new product or a new part of a product, you know, they're using microservices, you know, even if they hadn't previously, they'll maybe use microservices and containers for this new piece of functionality. And at the same time they're making those technology choices, they're also deciding to respond to problems in a different way at the same time. So while they might have a network operations center that's, you know, that's triaging and handling the remediation of problems specifically for an older piece of functionality or an older part of the business, they are, when they release this new functionality that's using new technologies, they'll bypass the network operations center and use tools like ours to specifically send alerts and get people remediating the problem before a human in a network operations center actually even knows there's a problem. And so I would kind of present that as a pattern that I see people using, and I think that's actually a pretty good model. I mean, big companies aren't going to change the way they do things, but they will change the way they do things in the future, and they're willing to kind of let that play out over the next 10 years, and as old services kind of decay and go away and new ones come on, pretty soon, after 10 years, you know, they've moved a predominant amount of their architecture to kind of a new way of thinking and new technologies, and that's sort of the way they go at those things.
Yep. Excellent. Anybody else on the panel want to chime in, or can we move to our next one?
This is Joni. I definitely second everything that Todd just said. Another key thing that we see is folks are undertaking huge revamps of how they do monitoring. Sometimes right now we see a team of operations people whose whole job is just to find the signal through the noise. And it inhibits people from bringing developers on call because they don't just want to spread pain of bad alerting to other people who are delivering business value. So another good step is to do sort of an audit of ensuring that your alerts are actionable, and when they are, routing them to the right person. So like we talked about a lot throughout this entire presentation, engineers who built code are more apt or more welcome to identify problems or problem solve within things that they have domain expertise in. So cleaning up what exists today and ensuring that you're monitoring the right things and with the right thresholds and there is limited noise, and then being able to route the actionable alerts to people who are more directly related to solving the problem or can solve it more quickly is sort of then a downwind step from that original idea.
Fair enough. If no one, I'm going to jump to the next one, and this is one, guys, that I've actually heard in person, right at. Looks like I got muted there I muted myself. I apologize. So, guys, this is one I actually have heard in person in the past. And what is the difference between chat and chat ops? It's not the same thing, obviously. I've actually asked Jason Hand on the team about it, but let's hear it for our audience. How would you define the difference between chat and chat ops?
Yeah, so the way I define it, which I think is pretty close to the way Jason defines it, is, you know, chat's an awesome tool to you know, kind of work out problems. You can do it in our product. You can also do it in Slack. You can do it, you know, kind of whatever works. But what's great is it documents what people are doing, so you can always kind of look back in history as opposed to, like a pure phone call. And you can sort of see people solving problems in real time with some amount of data augmentation, not only what they're doing, but what the system is kind of doing. So I put that in the chat domain. When you kind of attach the chat ops part to that, to me it implies that you're starting to do remediation through Hubot or different bots that do kind of macro changes to the infrastructure via commands. So one is kind of the interaction of people, and the latter is the interaction of people plus the sort of the automated, ability to change pieces of the system, all while you have all this documentation sort of built into it. It's always been a fundamental part of the way we solve the problem in the marketplace, and obviously it's where we think things are going.
I have some views on that, but let me see if anyone else on the panel wants to chime in.
I think you got it, Todd. I think one thing, I talked to Jason about this, and it's basically just juxtaposing conversation with context and action. So you're getting everything in place. So you can go back and have a really nice retro and see not only conversations, but see what happened, and so that it's all captured electronically.
Yeah, which is pretty consistent with what we see in our customer base. Retrospective tools in our product are probably the #1 used functionality that isn't real-time functionality.
Fair enough. To me, guys, I think also one of the important things is when we're talking about chat, to me that involves humans only, communicating, whether it be verbally or written or via text or what have you. But the term chat ops to me encompasses not only that human-to-human interaction, but human-to-machine, human-to-system interaction. And it's not just the interaction causing changes or affecting change, but it's also the input of data to both human and machine that gives us information or gives us a ability to do analysis. So chat to me is just straight up human to human chat, and it's been a characteristic of humans since the dawn of time. Chat ops kind of represents cyborgs, if you will, right? Where we have human to machine interactions as well. Anyway,
the machines are coming for us, Alan. They're coming.
I've known it for some time, Todd. But hey, oh boy, I think you guys are too cold out there. Anyway, next question. So again, this is a fairly common question we hear in DevOps, right, in general, which is, DevOps is great for small companies, but I work in, the 800-pound gorilla shop, and we move pretty slow. Like, we measure it in archaeological terms. But, what can I do to make it move faster? And is all of this chat ops and new way of doing things and on-call, is it really applicable to me? Todd, I think I know what your answer is going to be, but tell me.
Yeah, well, this is, welcome to being in the technology profession, right? I mean, it's, you can go back 20 years and find people that say, that Agile stuff's never going to take off. But, the fact, get off my yard, no Agile here. But the fact is, that's how people are doing things, right? So I hear it. It is more of a challenge in larger organizations, which is kind of why I offered what I see large organizations doing that we talk to every day, which is, hey, they experiment, right? Let's take a new service we're going to build, and let's go all in and do it that way. And based on the data we see, that's a customer that buys 8 seats from us, and then 2 years later they have 600 seats. So that would suggest to me what happens when you go in with an open mind and try to do it even in a very large company. But it's like anything in technology. There's always going to be a challenge. There's always going to be the old guard and the new guard, and digging your heels in technology is always a losing battle.
It is, but Yeah, time waits for no one, and progress doesn't stop either. It's fair, but let me just prod you a little deeper, though, Todd. Constructive. Can you give me? Here's the top 3 things or top 3 tips, or not just you, Todd. Anyone on the panel. Top 3 tips that you can take back to your large company to help kick this stuff off, to help get someone's attention.
Honestly, here's what I do, and it's more of a learning exercise than anything else. We just got back from AWS reInvent. It's a big conference for us every year, the Amazon Web Services conference. Take somebody in a management position that hasn't ever gone to that conference to it, and it will blow their mind, right? The whole world is moving up the stack, right? You don't, even as a large company, you're probably no longer running your own infrastructure. You're increasingly buying infrastructure from somebody else, right? Instead, what you're focusing on is delivering value to your customers at the application layer, and that comes out in spades when you go to that conference and you really listen to what large companies that you would not think are innovators are doing every day, right? The proliferation of monitoring platforms, the 35 new ones that have been born in the last 4 or 5 years, are all focused on the application layer. They're not trying to figure out if you have connectivity to a router, right? That's because companies aren't doing that anymore. The companies are really focusing on the application layer. They're using New Relic, they're using Sumo Logic, they're using things that directly speak to developers. And that's because developers are the only ones that can solve the problems, they're the only ones that can create the code, and they are the ones that largely deliver the value. So my advice is you don't have to believe anybody if you're in one of these companies. Just go to that conference, and you'll be blown away with kind of the macro trend of companies that you would not think are progressive companies and what they're doing every day.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Going to AWS reInvent, expensive proposition, but even just giving them Gene Kim's Phoenix project, or for that matter, Jason's ChatOps books, or I think the real issue there, Todd, is so many executives, especially if they're not from a technical background, are just not, or even if they were once, they don't stay current with what's happening. They don't realize what the potential is, and just a little bit of education goes a long way with these.
I agree, and there's always a group that are running the clock out. They're just going to run the clock out and say, oh, I can't learn this anymore. I'm just all done with it. But there's usually somebody that's a click below them in the organization that doesn't feel that way, and it's just get them involved in these kind of things. And you cannot go to that event and come away with anything other than the sheer magnitude and scale of what's happening, and think to yourself, I better pick up a book here.
Absolutely. I mean, it's kind of like me with music. I don't think anything good's come out since 1985, but whatever. Let's go to our next question. I can't even imagine putting my developers on call, because after all, developers are the alpha predator of the food chain. How do you go about that? Getting your developers to want to be on call.
So there's a couple things that drive toward this, right? And I mentioned them in the presentation, which is this drive towards things like Docker, and then microservices and code ownership, right? Code ownership, in my opinion, is the key to happiness for software engineers. All the years I was writing software, I hate it when I kept having to be parachuted into parts of the code I'd never seen before and commit code crimes sometimes just to get some problem solved. And then I'm airlifted back out of it, and I felt no ownership. When people said, hey, you know what, I think that part of the system is broken, my first thought was, yeah, probably, because nobody knows how it runs, right? So to me, this code ownership, microservices, the whole Docker thing really creates a culture around owning the code. And if you own the code, you're pretty happy to support the code, right? Where most of the unhappiness comes, and this is in every year of this thing we do, is, and it comes out kind of in the individual pieces of data that aren't easily rolled up, is this notion of hey, I'm happy to get up at midnight if my part of the system breaks, because I'm naturally inquisitive why it broke. I wrote it. I'm a pretty smart guy. Why did that break? I want to know, and I can solve it quickly, and that's relatively low stress to me. But the opposite is high stress. And the problem we've had in this industry that we're trying to solve for sure is route the problem to the guy who wrote the code, because he's got no problem solving it. And this is why, so what happens is naturally, and I alluded to this earlier, we have customers that start with 8 seats and go to 600. And the reason they go to 600 is they adopt this model. And all the engineers are happier because they're only solving problems they know how to solve, one. And two, the company's happier even though they're buying more seats because the problem's getting solved a lot faster than it would have in a world where it gets escalated, escalated, escalated. And every escalation step is somebody that's trying to figure out what the hell is going on. And that is slow, and it's bad news bears. So to me, the real answer is if you sort of understand the end game with this, engineers are much happier if they're on call for stuff they've written, and the level of noise is considerably lower, and that's sort of the end game. Now, presenting that case, can be challenging with companies, but I think it's really presenting that whole use case that really helps companies get over the hump, and usually it happens, for us within 9 months, a company will go from a few seats to hundreds of seats. So that's a proxy for me for how that stuff gets adopted.
Great. Here, another question here. Where do you see the place for outsourcing of dev and ops activity, given the view that those that develop the code have to be the ones to fix it? Is it still possible to outsource dev or ops or DevOps?
I don't think it's possible to outsource DevOps at all. I think it's an inherent piece of what the company is. If anything, that's the one part that definitely should be intrinsic to the company because it's the most connected to the business relationship. If you look back 15 or 20 years, the problem inside companies was engineers just wrote code and, see ya, I hope it works out. And it was so disconnected from the business entity that's why software, software projects would fail, and there was a lot of dissatisfaction, and that's literally what led to Agile, right? Was this complete disconnect, a totally sort of messed up situation. And Agile was adopted, continuous integration and delivery. All this has been a chain that's kind of worked its way down the road, and DevOps is the most connected to the business. So I think you can outsource some software, but I think the closer you get to how it connects to the business and the operations of it, the least likely you can actually successfully outsource that behavior.
I would also add, take a good look at what it is that you're outsourcing. I've gone to a lot of large companies as part of adopting our tool, and they have tier 1 folks who is essentially just a call center in another part of the world with very limited access to actually solving any problems, who are just sort of this first line of defense, right? So this is more on the operations or on-call side. And all of that is a waste of time. And at the end of the day, people are looking to get rid of this thing that's actually quite a large expense. Even if it's offshored, it's expensive to have humans 24/7 fielding phone calls and writing tickets. So in the case that, they really are just fielding customer requests or something that's a little bit removed from your actual production system, fine. But if it is related to you operating your code in production and potential downtime, I would take a really good look as to what that outsourced resource is actually giving you, or if it's actually just taking more time for fear of more proactive delivery to folks on your team wherever it is that you're located.
Great. Okay, I think we've got time for one more question here, and there's another. I mean, the question is not exactly what we hear, but we hear a similar kind of thing. So, making it selfish to the eye. What is it? What's in it for me? From a professional development perspective, if you're just a straight up ops guy today, right? And that's your job, and it's a good job. It's an important job. What should you do to continue to grow, to prosper, to move up the chain, to stay current?
So DevOps isn't 100% good. And the part that isn't good is there used to be, and I had companies that did this, so I feel like I'm speaking from a position of strength there, is pure operationally minded people look at the world a different way, right? They are all about customer satisfaction, the total uptime of the system. They're less exploratory about why it broke and more about get that shit working again. And that can get lost in the DevOps world unless you sort of have that mindset around the table. So I think that's why a lot of people in that, that are kind of in more traditional ops roles are moving to, site reliability and things where the strategy of how to protect the customer and how to, successfully operate the software still lives. But the fact is they can't solely solve problems themselves anymore. So I encourage them to move into these more strategic roles that I think are actually much more interesting to the company. If you're an employee, you want to deliver the most value you can. And I think that's the place to go, right? It's like, because there is a lack of behavior pattern in some DevOps teams for that. Instead they do all the great things you want them to do. They're very inquisitive. They want to know why something broke, but they're willing to extend downtime to get that information. And that's always a kind of a push and a shove in these organizations. So I think it's good to have that person around the table that has sort of that classic operations mindset, but you also sort of need the other one too, which is, hey, let's take 3 more minutes of downtime so that I can get this piece of data. Otherwise, we'll never know what happened, right? So it's I think there's a good tension in an organization to have those things. So that's what I would suggest they do. If you're provisioning, instances on AWS by hand, it's like your job's going away. So do something else.
Yep, and that's a fact of life too, guys, right? And it goes not just for ops or tech jobs, but jobs in general. Times are changing, and you got to stay up on it to be up there. Anyway, guys, at this point, we're at the top of the hour, and I don't like to keep people long. I know we all have stuff to do. So we'll call it a wrap. VictorOps, folks, again, thanks for sponsoring today. Thanks for presenting. And most of all, thanks for being consistent in this state of on-call report, because I think it gives us all some nice insights into where we are and where the industry is and where we're going. So keep up the great work. Congratulations on your recent capital raise, which I think we reported on. And we hope to have you on another DevOps webinar soon.
Awesome. Thanks, Alan.
Thank you.
We enjoyed it.
All right, guys. Thank you very much. This is Alan Schimmel, Editor-in-Chief of DevOps.com. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you again soon on another DevOps webinar. Have a great day, everyone.